The night was absolute. Wind tearing across black water, snow flurries twisting under a sickle moon. Deep beneath the waves, U-264 prowled east of Greenland, her commander hunched over the radio shack's dull green glow. A message had just come through from BDU headquarters. Convoy detected. 240 miles northeast, course west by northwest. He grinned. Perfect hunting ground. The radio operator adjusted the dial, transmitting their acknowledgement in the clear. Just 4 seconds. A quick burst on high frequency, encrypted by Enigma and invisible to the naked ear. Then silence again. The sea groaned softly above them, the diesels idling. The commander lit a cigarette, watching the smoke curl toward the red emergency lamp. Somewhere beyond the black horizon, dozens of merchant ships moved slowly across the Atlantic. Blind giants carrying oil, food, and fuel. He imagined his torpedoes slicing into their hulls before dawn, but he never saw the signal the other way. 200 miles west, aboard HMS Duncan, a small team of Royal Navy signalmen leaned over a glowing cathode ray tube. The line spiked. The bearing needle steadied at 067 degrees. High-frequency contact, the operator whispered. The destroyer's captain nodded once. Within minutes, 3 escorts altered course simultaneously, their compasses converging on an invisible source. The U-boat had just signed its death warrant. Its transmission, a 4-second flicker of electrons, had lit up across the Allied network like a flare in the dark. From Iceland to Newfoundland, from shore stations to convoy escorts, lines crossed, bearings met, and the ocean's secret point of origin appeared on a map. The Germans thought they were tracking the convoys. They never realized the convoys were listening back. When the Second World War began, the ocean belonged to sound and to silence. It was a battlefield measured not by territory but by detection. And in 1939, no one understood that better than the Kriegsmarine's U-boat arm. The logic of the Wolfpack Germany's strategy was simple in concept, but terrifying in execution. A single U-boat could do damage, but a Wolfpack, a coordinated line of submarines stretched across shipping routes, could annihilate convoys. The key was communication. Dozens of submarines, each alone in thousands of square miles of sea, relied on radio bursts to find each other and to home in on merchant targets. Every U-boat carried a funkroom, the cramped radio room. Operators used high-frequency, HF transmitters to send short-coded signals back to command centers in occupied France or Norway. Each message, encoded by the Enigma machine, was believed to be untraceable. Messages were short, often only seconds long, and at those frequencies radio waves could travel hundreds, even thousands, of miles by reflecting off the ionosphere. To the Germans, this was genius. They could coordinate their entire undersea fleet through the air, unseen, unreachable, and secure. How radio became a weapon. The Kriegsmarine's radio network was both nerve system and heartbeat. The Befehlshaber der Unterseeboote, BDU, Admiral Karl Dönitz's headquarters in Lorient, sent and received hundreds of signals daily. Submarines reported positions, fuel levels, contact sightings, and attack results. In return, Dönitz's staff redirected boats, formed new wolf packs, and warned of enemy aircraft or escorts. These signals were short but constant, and the Germans prided themselves on their radio discipline. Operators were trained to transmit for no longer than 20 seconds, believing that the Allies could never locate a signal so brief. The ocean was vast, the odds infinitesimal. It was a reasonable belief, until mathematics and antennas began to disagree. The early Allied blindness in 1940 and 1941, the Allies were losing the war of sound. Convoy after convoy vanished in the mid-Atlantic. In some months, 1 out of every 4 merchant ships never reached port. The Royal Navy's surface escorts and aircraft patrolled endlessly, but they were fighting ghosts. U-boats appeared, struck, and melted back into the sea. Intelligence teams broke occasional Enigma keys, but cryptography alone could not protect ships fast enough. The problem wasn't what the Germans were saying, It was where they were saying it from. If only the Allies could trace those fleeting bursts of HF transmission to their source, they could anticipate ambushes before the first torpedo was fired. But direction finding, as it existed then, was slow and clumsy. Large shore-based antennas could pick up bearings, but triangulation took hours, sometimes days, and by then convoys were already burning. Signals and shadows. The ocean in 1941 was a paradox. Every U-boat needed to talk to survive, but every transmission risked being overheard. British engineers began asking, could we turn those whispers into coordinates? Some remembered the experiments from the 1930s, primitive radio direction finders that used rotating loop antennas to locate transmitters. They were useful for navigation, but not for war. The equipment was large, slow, and useless against fleeting bursts. What they needed was speed, something that could give a bearing almost instantly, with no human lag between hearing and plotting. The birth of a new idea. In a small laboratory in Britain's Admiralty Signal Establishment, engineers led by Robert Watson Watt and his peers began adapting an older technology, used for meteorology and early radar, into a naval instrument. Their concept: use twin antennas to detect phase difference between incoming radio waves, instantly giving the direction of the transmitter. The system was called high-frequency direction finding, or HF-DF. Sailors, unable to pronounce it amid the chaos of battle, shortened it affectionately. Huff-Duff. It was about to change the Atlantic forever. By mid-1941, the North Atlantic was collapsing into organized chaos. Convoys burned nightly. Shipyards couldn't replace what was being lost. The only advantage Britain had left was its scientific stubbornness, the willingness to turn laboratories into battlefields. Making Huff-Duff sea-ready at first, HF-DF existed only as bulky, shore-based towers, 200-foot masts built on headlands from Scotland to Newfoundland. They worked, but they were slow. A U-boat could surface, transmit, and dive again before a triangulation report even reached the Admiralty. To matter, the technology had to move on to ships. In 1941, an engineer named W.A.S. Butemant, working for the Admiralty Signal Establishment, designed a compact receiver with twin vertical antennas that could be mounted on a destroyer's bridge. It measured phase difference electronically, giving an immediate bearing in seconds. No mechanical rotation, no guesswork. To the sailors who saw it for the first time, it looked absurd. 2 short rods and a dial. Yet that dial could point a ship directly toward a transmitting U-boat, even if the signal lasted only 3 seconds. The American expansion. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, British scientists carried their secret westward. Within months, U.S. Navy engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory and Bell Labs had refined the British design into rugged, mass-produced shipboard systems. The Allies established a network of hundreds of shore, HF-DF stations across the Atlantic, from Iceland and the Azores to Newfoundland and Bermuda, all linked by teleprinter to operational headquarters. Each station reported bearings of detected transmissions. When 2 or 3 lines crossed, on the plotting chart, the intersection marked the U-boat's probable position. What had once taken hours now took minutes. The Americans extended this logic into convoys themselves. Escort ships were fitted with smaller Huff-Duff sets so that when a U-boat sent a contact report to its headquarters, multiple escorts could take instantaneous bearings. A few calculations. Later, they knew exactly where the submarine was hiding, and often sank it before the next transmission. By early 1942, this web of antennas and operators had effectively turned the Atlantic into a radar made of sound. Convoys that had once sailed blind now moved within an invisible net of radio bearings. Each time a U-boat commander pressed his transmitter key, his position lit up across the network. Every Wolfpack signal gave away the hunter's coordinates to the hunted, and yet, inside the U-boat headquarters at Lorient and Paris, confidence remained unshaken. The Enigma machine's reputation for perfection had become its greatest weakness. German commanders assumed their codes were unbreakable, and by extension their transmissions were safe. they never understood that Huff-Duff didn't decode their messages. It simply heard where they came from. The turning of the tide. By 1943, Huff-Duff had become standard on nearly every Allied escort ship. Operators were trained to read bearings as naturally as compass headings. Convoy commanders could now anticipate ambushes, reroute merchant ships around submarine concentrations, and even direct hunter-killer groups toward transmissions thousands of miles away. The Germans were still talking. The Allies were now listening faster than they could speak, and somewhere on the floor of Dönitz's headquarters, the radio logs kept growing, filled with coordinates that no longer mattered, because the enemy already knew them. The silent, unseen war had just become a contest of who could listen more clearly, and by 1943 the listeners were winning. At its heart, Huff-Duff was not magic, it was geometry. Every radio wave travels through space as a pattern of oscillating energy. When it strikes two antennas placed apart, it reaches one slightly before the other. The difference, just microseconds, can be measured as a phase shift. From that, the machine calculates the direction the signal came from. In older radio direction-finding systems, operators had to rotate loop antennas manually until a null point was found, a process that took tens of seconds. Against U-boats transmitting for only 2 or 3 seconds, that was useless. The Huff-Duff set fixed this problem by using 2 orthogonal antennas and an oscilloscope display. When a signal came in, its phase difference deflected a bright line across the cathode ray screen. The operator didn't rotate anything. He simply read the angle instantly. That angle was the bearing. On convoy escorts, it was called out immediately to the bridge. HF contact bearing 085 degrees. If 2 or more ships recorded bearings within a minute, the convoy's operations officer could mark an intersection on his plotting chart. That cross marked the probable U-boat. The entire sequence, from detection to triangulation, could take less than 2 minutes. Compared to the hours once needed by shore stations, it was a revelation. For the first time, the ocean had coordinates for its ghosts. The men who used Huff-Duff lived in a world of whispers. Their cabins were sealed, lined with insulation, lit only by the glow of the cathode ray tube. The set emitted constant static, the hiss and crackle of the entire Atlantic compressed into one speaker. A trained operator could tell at once if a burst came from atmospheric noise, a distant broadcast, or a submarine's shortwave transmission. Every Allied convoy carried at least one such operator. He slept in short shifts, headphones clamped even during meals. He didn't see the convoy, the sea, or the enemy. He saw angles, a world reduced to numbers and pings of light. When the line on his scope twitched, he pressed a switch and shouted the bearing to the bridge. Sometimes the signal lasted less than 3 seconds. A U-boat calling in a position report. If another escort nearby caught the same signal, the 2 bearings crossed on the chart. A course change followed. The convoy slipped away. A submarine lost its prey. These were not glamorous men. No medals, no photographs, no cheering crowds. Yet by late 1943, historians would say that every convoy that reached Britain intact did so because of them. They were the invisible sentinels who turned the sea from mystery into mathematics. Huff-Duff did not work in isolation. Its brilliance lay in how it merged with a sprawling, Allied information web, one that stretched from Bletchley Park in England to radio outposts on the coasts of Africa and Canada. When a U-boat transmitted a message, 3 different systems reacted. Huff-Duff bearings pinpointed its origin. Radar-equipped patrol planes were vectored to the coordinates. Bletchley Park cryptanalysts, intercepting the same signal, decrypted its content using the day's Enigma key. What emerged was something entirely new in warfare, a real-time intelligence loop. Within minutes, Allied command centers could know who was transmitting, where they were, and what they had said. Convoys that once blundered into ambushes now changed course hours in advance. Hunter-killer groups of destroyers used triangulated positions to preempt wolf-pack gatherings. The once lethal cooperation between German submarines collapsed under the weight of its own communications. Every time Admiral Dönitz tried to direct his fleet, his fleet broadcast its position to the enemy. It was the cruelest irony of all. German efficiency turned into its own beacon. By 1943, Allied control rooms were filled with maps unlike anything seen before. They didn't show only coastlines and shipping lanes. They were covered with thin red pencil lines radiating from shore stations and convoy escorts. Each line represented a Huff-Duff bearing. When several lines crossed, officers drew a small circle, marking a probable U-boat position. The circles often moved like chess pieces, plotted and erased with each new transmission. Over time, those circles began to form patterns, clusters marking refueling rendezvous, patrol grids, even submarine transit routes between bases. Analysts began predicting not just where submarines were, but where they would be. This predictive geometry gave the Allies something even Enigma alone couldn't: foresight. Convoys rerouted around danger zones weeks before wolf packs arrived. Aircraft waited over predicted ambush points. By the summer of 1943, the kill ratio had flipped. For the first time, more U-boats were being sunk than convoys attacked. It was not one weapon or one ship that won the Battle of the Atlantic. It was a web of listeners, the quiet revolution of men and machines who made the ocean transparent. For the men of the Kriegsmarine, radio was both sword and shield. The Enigma machine had given them an aura of invincibility. Encoded messages rattled out from U-boats every few hours, terse, mechanical, and supposedly unreadable. In their confidence, German captains grew careless with radio discipline. Messages lengthened. Position reports were repeated when not acknowledged. BDU headquarters demanded constant updates, believing coordination was their greatest advantage. But Enigma's strength blinded them to another truth. Encryption protects content, not location. Every time a submarine transmitted, the signal itself was a flare. No amount of coding could hide its origin from a directional antenna. What the Germans never grasped was that their enemies no longer needed to read the message. It was enough to know where it came from. By 1943, many German radio men noticed a strange pattern. Within hours of transmitting, Allied aircraft appeared overhead. Depth charges followed. The probability seemed too consistent to be coincidence, yet the cause eluded them. They blamed spies, radar, even witchcraft. No one imagined that small antennas on distant ships were mapping their every word. The Wolf Pack doctrine, Donitz's proud invention, began to unravel under its own dependence on communication. The tactic demanded frequent contact reports, each boat calling in when sighting a convoy so others could converge. But with Huff-Duff covering the Atlantic, those calls became homing signals for Allied hunter-killer groups. The more submarines spoke, the more they died. Allied convoys now appeared to turn preemptively, vanishing from ambush points. When U-boats regrouped elsewhere, destroyers and aircraft seemed already waiting. The commanders aboard the boats could not explain it, but the pattern was unmistakable. Between January and June 1943, losses soared from 15 to over 40 U-boats per month. The North Atlantic, once their hunting ground, had become a graveyard. For Dönitz, it was incomprehensible. His doctrine relied on communication. His fleet's survival now required silence. The contradiction tore at the core of his command. In the summer of 1943, fragments of captured intelligence finally began to clarify the mystery. Interrogated survivors from sunken U-boats spoke of Allied ships changing course moments after their transmissions. Some described seeing destroyers steer directly toward them within minutes of sending encrypted messages. In August, German technical officers began experimenting with their own direction-finding equipment, hoping to catch Allied signals. Instead, they discovered a devastating truth. Their own transmissions were easy to trace. The short HF bursts, once believed too fleeting to locate, created distinct, measurable bearings. On a graph, they could be triangulated with frightening precision. The realization hit BDU like a hammer. Their entire operational network had been compromised not by spies or code breakers, but by physics itself. No countermeasure could erase the fact that radio waves travel in straight lines. The sea, which had always concealed them, had turned traitor. Dönitz ordered new radio discipline. Transmissions must be shorter than 3 seconds, fewer per day, and only when essential. But silence bred blindness. Isolated submarines now hunted alone, cut off from coordination and intelligence. The wolf pack had dissolved into solitary predators, weaker, slower, and fearful. Submarine radio operators, once proud of their skill, now treated their transmitters like loaded weapons. Every message carried the possibility of death. Some crews switched to low frequencies. Others delayed transmissions until storms masked them. None of it worked. For those who survived, the war's end brought an understanding almost too bitter to bear. They had been defeated not by might, but by measurement. The Allies had learned to listen harder, faster, and farther than they ever thought possible. And that was the cruelest truth. The war for the Atlantic had ended the moment the U-boats started talking. May 1943. The Atlantic was still endless and black, but something in its rhythm had changed. For 3 years, Allied convoys had crossed those waters like cattle through a wolf's valley, escorted but vulnerable. Now the hunters were starting to starve. The setup: Convoy ONS-5 on April 22, 1943. Convoy ONS-5 left Liverpool for Halifax. 43 merchant ships, loaded with coal, steel, and machinery, creeping westward at 8 knots. Their escort screen, known as Escort Group B7, included 8 destroyers and corvettes: HMS Duncan, HMS Vidette, HMS Tay, HMS Leucistrife, and others, all fitted with the newest radar, sonar, and Huff-Duff. Far to the north, Admiral Karl Dönitz ordered a massive ambush. He deployed over 40 U-boats, forming wolf packs Star, Spect, and Fink. It would be one of the largest coordinated attacks of the war. Each submarine reported contact positions through encrypted Enigma bursts. Dönitz's headquarters plotted the convoy's path, but the same signals that guided his wolves were being traced, instantly, by Allied HF-DF stations from Scotland to Newfoundland. As the wolf packs gathered, the convoy's escorts already knew roughly where they were. The hunted were walking straight into the trap with eyes open. The first exchange. The sea listens back. By April 30th, HMS Duncan's Huff-Duff operator began logging short HF bursts to the northwest. The bearings came in quick succession: 024 degrees, 028, 031. Each was plotted on the chart room's map, forming an arc of lines that crossed neatly into a shaded ellipse. Multiple transmitters, close grouping, the officer reported. Wolfpack assembling. Without waiting for command approval, the convoy altered course south by west, slipping out of the U-boat's convergence line. The Germans never realized the shift. Their radio discipline, perfect in theory, had betrayed them in practice. That night, the first attacks came. 3 U-boats attempted to close in, guided by radar detectors and flares. They were met by radar pings, sonar pings, and depth charges that bracketed their position within minutes. U-Yawin 25 was crippled, then rammed and sunk by HMS Snowflake. For the first time, the advantage of surprise had reversed. The storm, May 4-5, 1943, a gale swept across the convoy, scattering ships, whipping the ocean into white peaks. Visibility dropped to 0. To the Germans, it looked like opportunity. Chaos favored the hunter. Dozens of U-boats lunged through the darkness, but the escort's HF-DF sets didn't care about weather. Every time a submarine transmitted, even to report attack results, its bearings spiked on screens across the escort group. Destroyers adjusted course silently, triangulating the source. One by one, the hunters found themselves hunted. By dawn, U-630 had been sunk by HMS Vidette, and U-531 was destroyed by HMS Pelican. Radar-equipped aircraft from Iceland arrived at first light, guided by HF-DF bearings relayed through convoy command. They sank U-125's sister boat, U-531, within minutes of contact. The attack on ONS-5 turned into a slaughter, not of the convoy, but of the attackers Dönitz's desperation in Lorient. Admiral Dönitz refused to believe the reports. He demanded new Enigma keys, suspecting code compromise. But Bletchley Park hadn't yet cracked that month's cipher. This victory wasn't from decryption. It was from direction finding. For the first time, German transmissions had become liabilities. The very system that allowed wolf packs to function had become their undoing. By May 6th, the convoy reached safety. 12 merchant ships were lost, a heavy blow. But the Germans had lost 6 U-boats in a single operation, and dozens more damaged or forced home. It marked the moment when Dönitz finally grasped the truth. The Allies had learned to see without seeing. The tipping point. Black May. Throughout May 1943, convoy after convoy repeated the same pattern. Whenever a U-boat transmitted, Allied HFDF lines converged. Destroyers and patrol aircraft moved to intercept. Another contact was lost. In 30 days, Germany lost 41 submarines, nearly a quarter. Of its active fleet, Dönitz withdrew all boats. From the North Atlantic on May 24th, the wolf packs were finished. The Germans had not lost the ocean to bombs or torpedoes, but to information. The Battle of the Atlantic had turned, invisibly, scientifically, irreversibly. And deep in the North Atlantic storms, the men of Huff-Duff had proven that the most powerful weapon in war could be a bearing and a line drawn across a map. After the victory at ONS-5, the transformation was total. By the summer of 1943, every major convoy crossing the Atlantic carried at least one destroyer or corvette equipped with Huff-Duff. The Royal Navy issued strict procedures. The instant a U-boat signal appeared, all escorts in range would take simultaneous bearings. Within seconds, their thin red lines converged on the plotting table, forming a cross that pinpointed the source with uncanny precision. In the Combat Information Center aboard HMS Duncan, operators stood over glowing charts where radio bearings, radar sweeps, and sonar echoes merged into a single tactical picture. For the first time in history, an ocean battle was being fought in real time. Convoy commanders no longer guessed. They knew. Even the merchant crews felt the difference. Gone were the nights of blind terror and helpless waiting. When torpedo wakes appeared, the escorts were already moving. Depth charges and hedgehogs thundered in the distance, not in panic but in choreography. Huff-Duff had become the unseen conductor of an enormous invisible orchestra, and every man aboard played to its rhythm. The German Navy tried to adapt. BDU ordered its boats to transmit only from the surface at night, or to relay through shadowing submarines stationed farther from convoys. But the Allied network was global now, a chain of shore-based HFDF stations stretching from Newfoundland to Gibraltar, from Freetown to Ascension Island. No matter where the U-boats sent their signals, the bearings crossed somewhere. The ocean had been wired for sound. By late 1943, the reports flooding Dönitz headquarters were impossible to ignore. Every pattern of losses pointed to one factor: radio transmissions. Crews swore they had obeyed every new discipline rule, yet Allied ships still appeared within hours. German engineers were ordered to investigate. They eventually uncovered intercepted Allied manuals describing HFDF installations aboard convoy escorts. The revelation was devastating. For years, Dönitz had believed the Atlantic battlefield to be invisible. Now he realized it was mapped, not by sight, but by the very signals that bound his fleet together. He raged privately. The Wolf Pack doctrine, his life's creation, depended on coordination, and coordination required communication. To abandon the radio would be to blind his fleet completely. To keep using it was suicide. In December 1943, he told his staff, "Our transmissions are being used against us. The enemy has found a way to hear their position." From that day on, Huff-Duff became a word whispered with dread in the Kriegsmarine's radio schools, a ghost of mathematics that no one could outrun. The final year of the Atlantic War was not a contest but a pursuit. Allied escort groups armed with Huff-Duff, radar, and improved sonar-hunted submarines in coordinated formations. Aircraft from escort carriers received real-time HF-DF bearings and attacked surfacing boats the moment their antennas broke the waves. The U-boats, once stealthy communications, now illuminated entire battle maps. Allied operation centers in Londonderry, Washington, and Bermuda combined Huff-Duff data with decrypted Enigma intercepts and radar intelligence, creating what historians would later call the world's first integrated intelligence network. By spring 1944, U-boats could no longer form wolf packs at all. They operated singly, transmitting rarely, constantly diving to avoid aircraft summoned by the invisible ears around them. The Battle of the Atlantic was effectively won before D-Day. The supply lines that fed Operation Overlord, millions of men, vehicles and tanks, crossed the ocean untouched, shielded not by armor, but by antennas. The end of the wolf packs. 250 words. In early 1945, as Germany crumbled, Admiral Dönitz gave one final order to his remaining submarines: transmissions only when necessary. It was a silent epitaph. The tool that had once made his fleet formidable had doomed it. When the Allies occupied Lorient and Bergen, they found archives of meticulously kept U-boat radio logs, hundreds of thousands of Enigma-encoded messages, each accompanied by timestamps and coordinates. Intelligence officers compared them against Allied HF-DF records and discovered an eerie symmetry. Nearly every signal correlated with an interception or sinking within days. In the end, it wasn't luck or code-breaking that destroyed Germany's U-boat arm. It was the relentless logic of physics, the fact that no message, however brief, travels without leaving a trail. The ocean had listened, and it had answered. By the time peace returned to the Atlantic, the wolf packs were gone. But their downfall had given birth to something larger, a new kind of warfare, fought not with shells, but with information. When the last U-boat surrendered in May 1945, the Atlantic finally fell silent. No more coded bursts crackled through the static. No more sonar pings echoed through the dark. The great radio war, the invisible duel of signal and countersignal, was over, but what remained was not quiet. It was understanding. The men who had built and operated Huff-Duff had done something that few engineers in history ever achieve. They had redefined the boundaries of perception. They had taken something intangible, radio noise, mere vibrations in the air, and turned it into geography. The ocean, once a world of guesswork and superstition, had become a domain of coordinates, bearings, and certainty. The Allied navies came out of the war not just victorious, but transformed. Huff-Duff wasn't viewed merely as a device, it was now a doctrine. During the post-war conferences at Londonderry and Washington, analysts dissected every major U-boat battle. Time after time, the same pattern appeared. Victory followed whenever HF-DF data had been instantly shared between escorts and shore networks. The system had turned convoys from prey into a coordinated machine. That principle, interconnected situational awareness, became the cornerstone of post-war naval design. Combat Information Centers, CICs, which had been improvised rooms filled with radio men and chalk charts, were formalized on every new ship. They became the digital nerve centers of future fleets, where radar, sonar, and radio direction finding were fused into one screen. The concept of networked warfare, a defining idea of the late 20th century, had been born in the static hum of 1943. When peace came, the technology of listening did not rest. The British kept their coastal HF-DF stations operational, while the Americans extended theirs into a vast hemisphere-wide lattice. From Newfoundland to Alaska, from Okinawa to Guam, new antennas rose, slender steel fingers listening to the world's electromagnetic heartbeat. By the 1950s, these networks had merged into the Cold War's most secretive alliance, NATO's combined HF-DF system, later known by the codename Wollenweber. Massive circular antenna arrays, elephant cages, sprouted near military bases across Europe and North America. Each could detect and locate a transmission anywhere on Earth, just as their wartime ancestors had done in the North Atlantic. The lineage was direct. What Huff-Duff had done to U-boats, Wollenweber would now do to Soviet submarines and long-range bombers. The Cold War ocean became a listening post the size of the planet. Engineers quietly acknowledged their roots. In internal reports, they called the new system HF-DF Mark X. Its ancestors, those crude twin antennas mounted on destroyers in 1943, had simply grown up. Yet amid the celebration of post-war innovation, many of the actual operators faded into obscurity. The men who had sat in tiny cabins aboard corvettes, tuning their receivers through endless static, received no medals for valor. They had not fired guns or dropped bombs. Their victories were measured in convoys that arrived safely, in ships that did not sink. Historians later called Huff-Duff the weapon that never fired. But among those who knew, it was more than that. It was proof that intelligence could defeat brute force, that knowledge itself could become a weapon of survival. One operator, interviewed decades later, said softly, "We didn't destroy the submarines. We just told the sea where they were hiding." In that simple line lay the moral of the entire campaign. Humanity's oldest fear, the unseen threat beneath the waves, had been conquered not by courage alone, but by comprehension. When the war ended, the HF-DF antennas were dismantled from destroyers, their metal frames rusting in shipyard yards. But their idea endured, the belief that the first act of defense is to listen. The end of the Second World War didn't silence the airwaves. It made them louder. Every new nation, every army, every corporation that discovered radio used it to speak, signal, or spy. The very frequencies that once carried U-boat orders now carried the heartbeat of an entire planet. And once again, those who learned to listen first held the advantage. In 1949, a secret U.S. Navy program known as Project Jezebel began installing underwater microphones across the Atlantic. These hydrophones could detect the low-frequency rumble of submarine propellers hundreds of miles away. When linked to signal processing centers on land, the system became the Sound Surveillance System, SOSUS. Its foundation was the same principle that had made Huff-Duff revolutionary: direction through triangulation. Instead of radio bearings, SOSUS used time delays in acoustic arrival. Instead of antennas, it used the sea itself as a conductor. By the early 1960s, the network ringed the Atlantic and Pacific basins, silently plotting Soviet submarines as precisely as Huff-Duff had once done to German U-boats. Operators in windowless bunkers at NAVFAC Argentia and NAVFAC Eleuthera watched glowing tracks on sonar scopes, calling out bearings and coordinates just as their predecessors had in 1943. Technology had changed. The mindset had not. The same rhythm persisted: detect, measure, triangulate, confirm. The descendants of Huff-Duff were still out there, listening through salt water instead of static. The Second World War had proven that information was as lethal as ammunition. In the decades that followed, the art of high-frequency direction finding evolved into a new discipline: electronic intelligence, or ELINT. By the 1950s, ground stations and reconnaissance aircraft were using arrays of directional receivers to capture enemy radar signals, missile tests, and even telemetry from space launches. The mathematical core was unchanged. Every emission, whether from a radar dish, a satellite uplink, or a ship's transmitter, could be reduced to a bearing, a location, and a signature. The U-2 and later the SR-71 Blackbird carried HF-DF pods that could map radar networks from 70,000 feet. Naval task forces employed shipboard direction finders that traced Soviet fleets far beyond radar range. And when the NSA was founded in 1952, its first engineers quietly credited their lineage not to cryptography alone, but to the humble Huff-Duff operators who had proven that the world's hidden chatter could be weaponized. What began as a tool of survival eventually transformed into a paradox. The more humanity learned to listen, the less private the world became. During the 1970s and 1980s, The same HF-DF mathematics used to protect convoys now powered early satellite interception systems and global communications monitoring. Massive listening complexes, Menwith Hill in Britain, Pine Gap in Australia, Misawa in Japan, sprouted around the globe, forming a planetary web of ears that could hear almost anything that spoke through the air. The invisible ocean of 1943 had become an invisible planet, mapped by its own noise. Huff-Duff's quiet revolution had grown into the age of surveillance. Every signal was now a story, every transmission a potential coordinate. The line between defense and intrusion had blurred into static. Yet behind the politics, the science remained pure, a testament to human curiosity. It was never born from greed or fear, but from one question whispered in a British lab: "Can we find them by their signal?" The answer reshaped the modern world. Every submarine hunter, every intelligence analyst, every satellite engineer who traces a signal's origin today is walking in the footsteps of those first destroyer signalmen who stared at the flicker of a cathode ray beam and called out, "Bearing 085. Their tools have evolved. Digital spectrum analyzers, phased arrays, machine learning algorithms, but their mission remains the same: make sense of the unseen. The antennas may be larger, the software smarter, the data infinite. Yet the heartbeat of Huff-Duff still echoes in every piece of electronic intelligence hardware on Earth. From the North Atlantic in 1943 to low Earth orbit in 2025, the logic has not changed. To find truth, you listen. To survive, you listen faster. By the time the 20th century ended, the descendants of Huff-Duff were listening to entire worlds, but they all began with the destroyer's operator, headphones pressed to his ears, hearing through the noise of war the faint hum of a U-boat giving itself away. The Second World War was filled with thunder, bombs, engines, sirens, and guns, but the victory that mattered most was silent. It was won by people who listened. On the bridge of a destroyer in the winter Atlantic, the air once crackled with the faint hiss of static. Somewhere in that noise lay a pattern, a burst of energy only 3 seconds long, crossing the ocean from a hidden submarine to its command. To most ears, it was meaningless. A flicker, a whisper, a breath of electricity lost in the wind. But to a trained operator staring at the glowing face of a cathode ray screen, that whisper was a direction, a bearing, a line across the void that turned uncertainty into knowledge. That moment, when a man could trace an enemy he could not see, marked something greater than a technological leap. It was a philosophical one. For centuries, war had been about who could strike harder or endure longer. But Huff-Duff taught humanity that survival belonged to those who could understand faster. The ocean no longer belonged to the boldest. It belonged to the most perceptive. When historians wrote about the Battle of the Atlantic, they counted ships sunk and convoys saved. But those numbers hide the deeper truth, that the turning point came not in explosions, but in awareness. Every safe arrival at Liverpool or Halifax was a victory of patience over panic, of silence over spectacle. The men who manned those direction finders rarely saw the ships they saved. They listened, plotted, called out bearings, and vanished back into the static. No medals, no glory. Just the hum of the headphones and the knowledge that their vigilance had guided thousands home. And in that calm persistence, a pattern was born, one that would shape every era that followed. Because Huff-Duff was more than a wartime tool. It was humanity's first global era, the first time we realized that the invisible could be mapped, that chaos itself carried coordinates waiting to be found. From those fragile antennas on destroyer decks came the lineage of sonar, radar, satellites, and the great listening networks that still circle the planet today. Each one a whisper louder than the last. Each one carries the same quiet promise. If you listen carefully enough, the dark will answer. The war ended long ago, but the act of listening, patient, mathematical, human, never did. It remains the truest victory Huff-Duff gave us, that sometimes, to win, you don't need to shout. You only need to hear.